Hello, welcome to Riga Security Forum 2023 podcast conversation, a series organized by Latvian Institute of Foreign Affairs. And today we'll have a conversation about EU's global outlook and southern neighborhood. Thank you for inviting me to moderate the discussion. I'm Gints Amoliņš of Latvian National Broadcaster LTV, and in today's discussion we will discuss EU's strategic approach towards security and other issues in a southern neighborhood, but also having a more global look at the issues. Today I'm honored to have two distinguished guests at the conversation. We have Mr. Álvaro Imbernón, Director of Strategy and Policy Planning Division at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Spain. Hello.
Hello, thank you for having me.
And we have Dr. Nathalie Tocci, Director of the International Affairs Institute in Italy, one of the top think tanks in the world. Hello.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, we're going to start off probably by the State of the European Union speech this fall by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, where she focused, amongst other things, also on relations and strategy of European Union and African countries with Africa. And there are, of course, several issues that have been on the forefront for years. One of them is migration, irregular migration. There's political and geopolitical changes and some coups in the Sahel region, which changes the things. And of course, also the raw materials, which with the EU's the green approach, green course, probably is going to become more important in the future. And let me start with a small excerpt, perhaps, from the address of the Ursula von der Leyen. There was a subsection in the State of the Union speech titled Global Migration and Security Policy, where she talked about Team Europe approach, a unified approach, and she also said that there has to be a unity of purpose towards Africa by the EU, the same as it was shown towards Ukraine. So, Nathalie, perhaps the first question goes to you about the EU vision towards Africa. Probably the EU's approach towards Russia's war in Ukraine after the full-scale invasion showed perhaps not 100% unity, but a unity which has not been seen for a long time. Regarding Africa, can there be a united and clear approach and vision towards Africa, and what would be the main interests there?
Well, thank you very much for this. Let me perhaps sort of start off by mentioning, and of course, you were referring to the State of the Union address, which of course was back in September. A lot has happened since then, and perhaps we can sort of move on to that later on. But to rewind back to where we were, just a couple of months ago, and I think, I guess implicit obviously in what I'm saying is that I do think that what happened on the 7th of October and what has happened thereafter has profoundly affected the EU's approach to the South in general, including to Africa. But perhaps let me just park that point for a moment and come back to, sort of where we were. I think, there were some elements in what von der Leyen was saying that, frankly speaking, were not new. That the European Union has been trying to approach migration by externalizing the issue is, frankly speaking, something that we have tried to do since the 1990s. And, it's a little bit like, sort of Einstein's definition of madness of, carrying on doing the same thing, thinking that it's going to lead to different results. there is something that, frankly speaking, really escapes me. How on earth do we think that we can actually address the migration issue by putting it front and center in our relationship with Africa? All relationships have to do with a give and take, right? Migration is our priority. It is not Africa's priority with respect to us. To think that we can fix this problem by handing out a little bit of cash left, right, and center is not going to do the trick. I cannot put it more explicitly than that. And as I said, we keep on trying to do the same thing. Now, I think it's worth reflecting, why is it that we keep on trying to do the same thing? And I think the reason why it is because when European leaders sit around the European Council, they disagree with each other concerning how to handle migration internally. What is very easy for them to agree is how to handle the issue externally. Now, the snag there is that the people that we should be negotiating with are not around that table, right? So it's very easy, basically, for European leaders to all agree to not deal with the issue internally and to just offload it externally when you basically don't have your interlocutors around the table. So anyway, that's as far as migration is concerned. But I think you also raise an important issue, which is actually new, which is related to the fact that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has awakened us to a reality that was in the making really for quite some time. And that is precisely what I think you were hinting at, initially when, the first resolution and then the second resolution 1 year later was presented at the UN General Assembly. We were all very happy with ourselves that 141 countries were voting together with us and condemning Russia. Then we kind of started looking at this a little bit more in detail. And on the one hand, realized that amongst the 30 odd countries that abstained, you basically had, the most populous countries in the world, like India and China, but that even amongst the countries that did vote with us, very few were actually willing to pay a price for upholding international law. One thing is to vote for a resolution, quite another is to pay a price, by which obviously I mean, for instance, things like participating in sanctions. And so all of a sudden we realized, hey, we've got a problem with the so-called global south, and particularly with the so-called power south, those countries that increasingly make their voices heard, increasingly have a weight in the world. Some of them are in Africa, some of them are, of course, in Asia and in Latin America. And hey, we've got to do something about this. So I think, on the one hand, there has been this new realization, but then when we try and actually develop policies towards the region, we fall back onto very old habits, which, as I said, were tried and tested since the 1990s and have failed.
No, you mentioned the global south as well, how EU is trying, my understanding is that awakening perhaps that there has to be more deeper approach to global south after Ukraine. Western countries in general, probably those who support Ukraine, how to talk with them, how to deal with them, how to persuade them to support Ukraine more in this case. Mr. Imbernón, you are dealing with general strategy and policy planning of Spain, looking forward, looking how to approach different countries or different regions around the world. Now, if we talk about the global south, there's been vying for the cooperation from those countries. There's what we talk now as BRICS Plus, for example, where BRICS has invited some other countries, including from Africa. There's African Union has become a permanent G20 member state as well. So what's your view on that? The EU's approach toward global south, is it there? Is it assertive? How it should be done? Is it possible to have a assertive, comprehensive strategy towards all these different countries?
Well, I should start with the term because it is not global. It is not in the south. It's not a bloc, and it's composed by different views and even ways of related with us and with multilateral institutions. So maybe it's not a very correct concept, but it is quite difficult to define. But everybody knows what it means. So, sometimes I use plural south, for example. And in the case of the EU, we have been focusing very much on the global south, especially in our efforts to support Ukraine. Nathalie was mentioning the different resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly, in which the EU invest very much in our global outreach, try to explain our views that the Russian aggression is not justifiable, that is against the UN Charter principles, and so it's and even Spain supported that global outreach very much, and it's also important for explaining that to counter disinformation, for example, the same goes for the blaming of the EU on sanctions for the food for grain shortages and problems with food security. But beyond Ukraine, we are incorporating more and more in the EU, also in Spain, global South approach, especially to prepare for a more geopolitical world. So because we are going to see more of this in the future, more violation of the UN Charter, also disinformation, and especially pragmatic hedging, a more transactional diplomacy. And in the case of Africa, but to the global south in general, it is important because we could cooperate in many different issues. I'm thinking in making more inclusive multilateral institutions for global reforms. We have the next year the United Nations Summit of the Future. We also have climate finance, SDGs on debt also. Also to address common global challenges like climate action, green energy, the twin transitions, migration, etc. But we have to do it in a diversified way because it's a very heterogeneous group, and we have to do it in a way to don't try to force anyone to choose a camp, and also try to avoid lecturing or ideological debates that today it is important, and Nathalie was also mentioning that. And especially this idea that we had that the battle of narratives, we have to change it for a battle of offers. So today we are entering a world with more great power competition, in which there is a clear crisis of multilateral institutions, and in the case of the EU, this is a problem for us because we rely on multilateralism, on rules, and globalization, and the world that is coming is more closed and more based on power. So we have to learn to play this game and to try to offer to our partners to give them to thinking what they want and to thinking what we can offer to them. So it's a challenge to play this game for the EU because we want to keep our values and our way of doing things, but it's important that we start to play this game and also to do it with like-minded partners. But in the case of Africa, there are many different aspects that in which we could collaborate, and that are important for the world that is coming.
So pragmatic, not lecturing, battle of offers seems to be one of the things that are important these days as well. Nathalie, now, of course, there's interests. You talked about externalizing migration issues and things like that. So the interest of the EU is probably among the main interests in Africa is how to deal with migration and it's a security issues as well in Sahel region especially. But you mentioned also that it's give and take, it goes both ways. So what is it perhaps that Africa wants from, or can we actually know what Africa wants from the EU to have this two-way street so that we get what we want and they get what they want, because there's dozens of countries?
Well, thanks for that. And actually, I'm going to relate this back to some of the points that Álvaro was making, and I totally agree with the approach. Let me perhaps try and sort of boil this down into a few points, and some of which are actually going to be reiterating what I just said. He rightly said, well, we don't have to force them to choose. And I think this is incredibly important. And let me just highlight perhaps, a paradox here. Rewind back again, to the early 2000s when George W. Bush said, well, you're either with us or against us. And we Europeans absolutely hated having to be in this position. Now, the truth is that actually we really struggle with a world in which it is neither with us nor against us. We know how to act with the like-minded. We know how to act with our adversaries. We generally don't go to war with them, but we do sanction them. So we have a toolbox basically for the with us or against us. We don't have a toolbox for the neither with us nor against us. And I think this is indeed what we have to develop. Second point, I think, again, he's absolutely right. We don't have to lecture about values. Now, having said this, we also, and I think this is really where the struggle is, have to make sure that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And what I mean by this is that the baby that needs to be saved are the values, right? If we kind of get rid of that baby, we kind of forget who we are. The bathwater that needs to be washed away is the lecturing and, in a sense, kind of old school approaches to political conditionality. Those tools, or shall I say, perhaps those channels of influence, were great in a world in which there was no competition, but unfortunately now there is competition, and so those channels of influence simply are not available in the same way. And I think we really struggle, so we know what we are no longer able to do, but we haven't come up with an alternative way of doing values. Now, does this mean that we have to scale back, still within the values camps, scale back? How is it that we, what kind of values is it that we can realistically promote, right? We probably cannot promote, democracies left, right, and center, or certainly not beyond, the circle of countries that want to actually enter the European Union, but which are, in a sense, at a lower level. If you see what I mean, at a lower level, the principles that we actually can continue to hope to promote. And what are the alternative channels of influence that we have available in order to do that? Third point is indeed, okay, so you have, and here is the, what's the offer, right? Because if we are to do this, indeed, we are, we need to do far more than what we're doing now in terms of making credible offers. I think, what these countries want, is fairly clear. They want, they want money, yes, indeed, but they don't want only money. They want to be able to develop economic partnerships that enable them to develop. And again, let's be very clear, we actually haven't done this in the past. And I think there is a real risk that we will continue not doing this in the future. As we have conversations about, for instance, critical minerals, I think we have to be extremely wary not to fall into new forms of extractionism. If we're interested in, the DRC's cobalt, what are we willing to do in order to encourage, incentivize the development of a battery industry in the DRC itself. Yeah? So this is not just about the development of industries at home. Of course, that is what we're interested in. We have great clarity about what we want. Yeah, we want to contain migration. We want the critical minerals. We have far less clarity about what we're actually willing to give. But as I said, what these countries want is actually coming quite clear. I mean, they tell us actually fairly clearly. And then perhaps the final point, which then, perhaps leads us also to include the disaster in the Middle East in this conversation, is really our credibility. If we are to have, half a leg to stand on when talking about norms and principles, there needs to be some level of kind of coherence in what we do. And perhaps, given that Álvaro's here, let me take this opportunity to thank the leadership that his country actually has been demonstrating on this particular front with respect to the war in the Middle East and sort of the conflict between Israel and Hamas. I think we would need far more European voices to take that kind of stance, to have, the minimum chance of actually being listened to in our conversations with Africa and with the rest of the world.
Now, Nathalie, yes, you mentioned the Middle East, and there's a recent article of yours in Politico about how there's a clear vision and united pursuit, united goals, and policy instruments of the EU towards Ukraine, which probably EU felt was really close, that it threatens it. But then you mentioned that in Africa, especially after the coups in Sahel region, the EU is pretty much at loss what to do. And then you mentioned the Middle East, basically, that there was a European consensus, you say, which was carefully crafted over decades, and it has been eroding towards the Middle East issues, and now EU have to confront that it has eroded, and it's you could probably see it on October or after the October 7th, what happened with Hamas attacking Israel and killing over 1,000 people there, and Israel now bombing Gaza Strip to target Hamas. Of course, there's member states in the EU with different policies, different foreign interests, and it's probably a really old question, but is there a possibility how to actually make EU not to stand on one leg on different kinds of issues in foreign policy? If that's even possible, do we have to change how the EU is made?
Well, I mean, yes, on the one hand, this could get us into, a conversation about decision making on European foreign policy. Is it, should we move towards qualified majority voting? I'm an absolute fan of this. But let me say, actually, I'm an absolute fan of this. And what has reinforced my views is not so much the Middle East, it's Ukraine itself, right? Because, of course, the Middle East is a case of division. I mean, it's a case of division which, and we've seen this in a very explicit way in the way in which EU member states voted in the UN General Assembly, where basically sort of the EU was split in three groups. So given that kind of split, qualified majority voting would not really address effectively that kind of problem. What qualified majority voting does sort of address fairly effectively is actually a different kind of division that we have actually seen not on the Middle East, but on Ukraine, right? So it is, what qualified majority voting would do would be preventing Viktor Orban, right? Sort of holding up the opening of accession negotiations on Ukraine in a few weeks in December, right? That is, I think, the kind of sort of problem to be addressed, which I actually think, given that here we are in Riga having this conversation, I think it's this that should actually make, countries in, the Baltics, Eastern Europe, really reflect about a sort of opposition that they've had for quite some time, towards questions like QMV, and actually realizing that it is by reforms such as QMV that it would be addressing issues that are very close to the national interests of countries in Eastern Europe. As I said, as far as the Middle East itself is concerned, I think in many respects, it's a deeper problem. We really need to go back to the drawing board. As I said, sort of the EU, and of course I should add that it was a pre-Eastern enlargement EU, but it had constructed a consensus on a two-state solution, essentially in the period from the late 1990s to the early 2000s. 99, 2003 was basically the period. And then what happened, of course, is that, there was the second, before then there was the second Intifada, and progressively you had a dying down of the Middle East peace process. Initially, we kind of pretended that we wanted to revive it. And then we even stopped pretending that we wanted to revive it. And I think the reason why we even stopped pretending is that that consensus that had been built internally had started eroding. Why is it that it started eroding? Well, it started eroding because as Israel itself moved from the right to the extreme right, and it started first implicitly and then very explicitly abandoning the goal of the two-state solution, those member states in the EU that have traditionally sided with Israel have progressively moved together with Israel to the right, basically, and therefore implicitly abandoning, I wouldn't say the two-state solution, but a meaningful definition of a two-state solution, because otherwise it can risk really being a slogan. So I think we really need to go back to the drawing board. We now know that we can't keep on pretending. We can't keep on sort of sticking our heads in the sand. This is an issue that has to be addressed, and it is not qualified majority voting that is going to enable to fix that problem. It is, in a sense, a far more grueling internal European discussion about what we actually think about the Middle East.
European Union as an entity and EU member states, and how to put a unified position which could make EU probably more impactful, and the things you were just talking about also probably relate to Africa, as you said, that we know what we want from Africa, but we don't know how to approach Africa. Right now, there's this what Mr. Borrell talked about last March, right after the full-scale invasion. There was his article about geopolitical awakening of the EU. Now, Álvaro, is there a Borrell talked about geopolitical awakening of EU last March. He also talks about making Europe a hard power, thinking in terms of power, which is what you can offer, how you can influence things, not necessarily militarily, but just to take a different approach, different view, how to approach international relations. Do you think this geopolitical awakening has come to fruition somehow over 1.5 years after that realization?
Well, as I was telling you before, we are moving to a more closed and conflictual world in which, by our own analysis, there are 3 crucial ongoing shifts today in the world, that we are moving from a world based on rules to a one based on power, so from cooperation to competition, that from a world that it was based on efficiency or focus on economics to a one more related with resilience or security, and a world that in which there was more trust in progress, to a world in which there's more uncertainty about the future. So to navigate this world, the EU needs to learn, as the High Representative usually says, to learn a little bit the language of power and to be more geopolitical. So this is something quite difficult because the constitutional nature of the EU is a system of common solution through consensus. You were talking about qualified majority voting, for example. So this is not a centralized superpower, and we have unique advantages, but also some difficulties in the way we do things. What we have been trying to push during the Spanish presidency of the Council of the EU is this idea of strategic openness or open strategic autonomy, that we need to reduce our vulnerabilities and dependencies and to diversify our relation and suppliers, but also we have to do it in cooperation with third parties, with others, in order to be more strategic in our way of doing things. We could say that we maintain unity during the COVID times, also the Russian aggression towards Ukraine, very different reaction, for example, for the EU, that the way we were doing things during the global financial crisis or during the 2015 refugee crisis. And this geopolitical way of doing things, it has been shown in the use of the European Peace Facility, for example, in sanctions towards Russia, and we are innovating a little bit in the way the EU is doing things. For sure, it's going to be a long path, because the DNA of the EU, it has been interdependence from the Schuman Declaration. This idea of the de facto dependencies. No, so our idea is that interdependencies are good, and they are good, and they are a way of trying to avoid conflict. And what we are looking today is a world in which the interdependencies could be weaponized. So it is not going to be 1 or 2 days. It's going to be a long path for the EU to be something close to a geopolitical entity. But I think we are starting our first steps. What we have been doing during our presidency is we have published a report on how the EU could do this. Resilient EU 2030 is the report that was sent to all the head of state and government before the Granada Informal European Council, and also the European political community. It was in October, 1 month ago, so more or less. And also we discussed there the Granada Declaration that was published, in which there are some of measures in order to act this way, but also there's in the Granada Declaration, this is quite clear written that enlargement of the EU is a geostrategic investment in peace, stability, and security for the EU, but at the same time, we should try to push for reform of the EU in order to have a Europe fit for 35 member states, maybe in the future. This is a very long way and a very long road. But we need to start thinking about the decision-making process of the EU, the budget, policies, institutions, and to prepare for this world that is going to be more complex. This is not the world that the EU is good at. This is not going to be a more open, multilateral, based on rules world. But we have to adapt, and we have to push for a more multilateral, open, rules-based order. But if it is not possible, the EU has to start to play by these rules also. This is very much related with the discussion we had with the Global South, and it is very much related with partners for which we could cooperate. And many of them, they're in the South. In the case of Spain, during the Spanish presidency of the Council of the EU, we have pushed very much for engaging more with Latin America, with the EU CELAC meeting, the first one from 2015, And the idea is to have a more institutionalized relation every 2 years, to have a meeting. Also, we have a new digital alliance with Latin America, and also and we have a critical raw materials agreement, the EU with Chile, with energy with Argentina and Uruguay. And yesterday, we organized in Barcelona the Union for the Mediterranean Summit. We had 27 ministers from across the Mediterranean coming here to Barcelona and to discuss common problems in the two river sides of the Mediterranean, plus what is going on in Gaza right now. And the idea is that there was, if you listen to the declaration of my minister or the High Representative, it was quite clear that there was a strong condemnation of Hamas, especially at the brutal attacks on the 7th of October, but also that Israel's response should attach to humanitarian international law. And we expect that the ceasefire could prolong longer and to make it permanent, and not to avoid that Hamas to be part of the solution. There's not going to be a military solution to the conflict. And maybe they should, Spanish proposal has been to organize a peace international conference, and the two states as a way of in the longer term to try to stabilize the region.
So yes, so all in all, EU needs to learn to navigate the world. We can put it that way, or the changed world, or has it been like that before already? But Nathalie, if we talk about learning to navigate arenas, and if we talk about Africa, and you already mentioned China, which has been active in Africa for years, I would say with mostly, and we talk about values, China's approach been with no strings attached approach in that sense, in terms of human rights and democracy. Well, at the same time, there is string attached to loan contracts. We've heard those stories, and Russia has been trying to put a footprint in Africa. Seems mainly via military approach, with especially over the past years. Now it's maybe a bit different since Wagner's semi-demise. In this situation, in this landscape, where does the EU fit in this landscape in Africa, with China being there, Russia trying to be there? Is EU active in Africa, or is it just watching what's going on in Africa?
Oh, so, I mean, obviously, we are active in Africa in the sense that, there are policies, there is presence, there is money. I mean, a number of things are there, but I think it's kind of worth asking ourselves, firstly, what isn't there, and therefore what else could be there. So I think, there is a question that has to do with goals. Sort of earlier, exactly. So you were mentioning now, the role of China. Earlier, I was mentioning, the fact of, do we have to sort of scale down some of our goals? We think of China, for example, in Africa as being a very influential player, right? And I think it's worth asking ourselves, why is it that we think that China is influential? I mean, is China influential in the sense of changing regimes to its image? No, it's not influential in that sense, yeah. But the point is that it doesn't even try. So in a sense, we measure effectiveness with respect to the goals that you put out for yourself. So, I think, and this is where I was sort of earlier, I was mentioning about, how is it that we can scale down, which doesn't mean abandon, but scale down in a way which is feasible, what falls into the values box. Let's put it this way. Is it about, for instance, not democracy promotion, but rule of law promotion? and what kind of rules are related to what kind of sectors. I mean, do we have to be far more specific, for example? So I think that's an element, in a sense, that we should probably be thinking more about. Then I think there's also a question that has to do with overall vision. And I think, nowhere is this clearer than in the case of the Sahel. So, in fairness, in the Sahel, we did have a vision. And we also thought that we had instruments. Yeah, I mean, sort of when now 8 years ago, I wrote on behalf of the High Representative of the Global Strategy, we put out something called the Integrated Approach to Conflicts and Crisis. And, here was the European Union that had a vision, and it was about using security and development and migration and all the rest of it in an integrated way. And what better example was there to highlight and exemplify what we were to do? That we were already doing, I should say. It was the Sahel, right? So this was the poster child of the integrated approach. And, I think there was a lot of value in that vision, but sadly, it has been swept away. So sadly, you were mentioning the coup epidemic in the region. We're simply now in a world in which the vision, the approach that we had has been, basically defeated. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. And, at times these things happen. But the problem that we have now is that we don't have an alternative vision. And we kind of fudge it a little bit, hiding behind, we support ECOWAS, for example. And, this is basically us living up to our slogans of African solutions to African problems. And it's very, good to support ECOWAS, but it does conceal the fact that we don't really know what we want ourselves. So I think there's an element of a vision. There's an element that has to do with the actual goals that you pursue. And then there's the discussion that we were having earlier about the means, where perhaps, what we should add to this discussion is that you take, for instance, specific instruments. They're not exclusively related to Africa, but they also concern Africa, like the Global Gateway. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of money involved in this, right? I mean, it's not as if the money's not there. But I think it's worth looking into how much of that money. I mean, let's also recall the fact that instruments like the Global Gateway were actually presented back in 2021, right? So this is 2 years ago, right? How much of this money has been spent as of today? And how much of the money that is spent is actually visibly attributed to the European Union? I haven't looked into the figures, and maybe I'm completely wrong, but I would be very surprised if those percentages are very high.
I think, well, thank you much. I think our time has come to end in this podcast, although there's an array of issues that I would like to still to discuss with you in future sessions. My personal main takeaways from this is that indeed the European Union needs to navigate this global arena, which is forming as it is right now. The realization of needing to be more pragmatic while not losing the values. There's also a battle of offers, as you said, and what to do with the European Union so it's not standing on one leg, perhaps too often, in its foreign relations and global approaches to different regions. For the next times, I hope we'll be able to discuss also issues how the EU can approach its allies and perhaps competitors and adversaries. It's China and the United States and Russia, all different global players. Thank you very much for your time today. Ms. Dr. Nathalie Tocci of International Affairs Institute of Italy and Mr. Álvaro Imbernón of Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you so much.